Death at Bishop's Keep. Chapter 31. A prudent mistress disciplines without resort to the whip, for a servant violently dealt with will respond in kind. Mrs. Augusta Manners, The Arts of Household Management, 1886. A half hour later, Kate finished her work. She set her desk in order and covered the Remington with its black oilcloth shroud. Aunt Sabrina had said she wouldn't be home for tea, and Kate, who was not yet accustomed to having people wait upon her, hated to put the servants to the bother of doing something she could do perfectly well for herself. She left the library to go down to the kitchen and find something to eat. But the kitchen was a scene of chaos. Harriet was huddled in a heap on the floor, her apron pulled over her head. Aunt Jagger's cap, hair, face streaming water, was shrieking in fury at Mrs. Pratt. And Mrs. Pratt, her cheek and eye reddened as if from a smart blow, was holding half the empty slops pail at the ready. "Slut!" Aunt Jaggers cried. "Fat, lazy!" "Hold your tongue," Miss Pratt cautioned, fiercely raising the bucket, "or I'll douse you again. The nerve of you hitting the poor child with your fist." "You are dismissed, cook," Aunt Jaggers shrilled. She raised her hand and stepped forward as if to strike Mrs. Pratt another blow. "Pack your bags and—" "Stop, both of you!" Kate commanded sharply. "What in heaven's name has happened?" "She hit Harriet in the face with her fist," Miss Pratt said in a tone of outrage. "And then she hit me. A woman's out of her bloody mind." "I won't have this brazen insolence in my house," Aunt Jaggers cried. "The girl is impertinent." "'Tis not your house," Miss Pratt retorted with great dignity. "'Tis your sister's house, and none of yours." Aunt Jaggers stamped her foot, her face livid. "Send Pocket for the constable, Niece Ardley. I want this woman jailed for assault." Miss Pratt's eyes were narrowed, her glance steely. "As to assault, 'twas Jaggers who struck the first blow against poor Harriet. All I did was—" Aunt Jaggers pointed a trembling finger. "You threw a bucket of slops on me." "There were half a bucket," Miss Pratt replied calmly. "And if need be, I'll use the rest of it and bucket besides." Her mouth tightened. "And as for pecking me bags, it was Ardley who hired me, and it'll be an Ardley who's what sacks me." "I think," Kate said firmly, "that we all had better calm ourselves." She looked at her aunt. "I do not believe this is a matter for the constable, Aunt Jaggers. My Uncle O'Malley is a policeman, and I know that they are reluctant to intervene in domestic matters, and there would be embarrassment of—" "Who asked you to intervene, miss?" The Aunt Jaggers' face was wrathful. "When the constable comes, I will order him to—" But Kate did not discover what order her aunt intended to give the constable, for Mott came into the kitchen at that moment, carrying a cold scuttle. Aunt Jaggers, apparently feeling outnumbered, choked off her threat, glared balefully at the three of them, and then stamped out. Crooning words of comfort, Mrs. Pratt bent over the sobbing Harriet and lifted her to a chair. With a savage look at Aunt Jaggers' departing back, Mott thumped the scuttle on the hearth and went outside, slamming the door behind him. "Do you think we should summon the doctor?" Kate asked worriedly, with a look at Harriet. The girl's cheek was heavily bruised, and her right eye was beginning to swell. "No," Miss Pratt said, smoothing Harriet's hair away from her face. "I'll make a comfrey poultice. The doctor could do no better." She went toward the pantry. Impulsively, Kate bent over the frightened girl. "It'll be all right," she said, touching her cheek gently, but she was at once swept by a feeling of sad helplessness. How could she promise Harriet that Aunt Jaggers' brutality would be restrained when she herself was vulnerable to the woman's whims? If Aunt Sabrina would not do what should be done, no one could protect the servants. Biting her lip and wishing she had not offered such an easy comfort when there was none to be had, Kate turned away to prepare her tea. She kept her eyes on what she was doing, but as she heard Mrs. Pratt moving about the kitchen, preparing Harriet's poultice, a gnawing apprehension and kind of fearful expectation grew in her mind. "Jaggers is who killed Jenny," Mrs. Pratt had said bitterly. "All of us knows it, all of us hates her for it." Kate could not escape the terrible feeling that a hurricane was about to strike above stairs, and a volcano about to erupt below, and that both events would leave behind a scarred and barren landscape that none of them would be able to recognize. There was a soft knock at the back door. With an unreadable glance at Kate, Mrs. Pratt moved toward it. "Who's there?" she called out quietly. "Tom Potter," a muffled voice replied. Kate frowned. "Tom Potter?" "All of us hates her for it. Tom Potter most of all." Mrs. Pratt faced Kate. "If you're done making the tea, miss," she said pointedly, "Maud'll take that tray up for you." Kate picked up the tray she had prepared. "Thank you," she said, "but I can do it." She walked toward the door to the stairs. When she reached it, she turned around. Mrs. Pratt had already admitted Tom Potter, speaking to him in quick, hard sentences. He was a slender, boyish-looking young man in a rough brown coat, brown trousers, and brown felt hat. A fierceness shone in his eyes, and when he stepped to the fireplace to bend over Harriet, his voice was soft but vibrating with scarcely restrained anger. "Don't cry, child," he said quietly. "We'll make it right. I swear to you, she'll not be beaten here again." Mrs. Pratt stepped swiftly forward, interposing herself between Kate and the visitor. It was clear that there would be no introduction. Instead, she said, her voice level, "I'm grateful to you, miss, for what you did this evening." "I wish I could have done more," Kate said. "You did what you could." She squinted at Kate, considering. "'Tis true your uncle's a copper?" "Yes," Kate said. Cook said thoughtfully. She seemed about to say something else, but instead grasped the stairway door and opened it so that Kate could go through. "Well, ring if you want anything else." "I shall," Kate said. "Thank you." The apprehension did not leave Kate as she carried her tray upstairs to her room. Rather, it was magnified by the recollection of Jenny's lover vowing to right Harriet's wrongs. All considerations of morality and ethics aside, Aunt Jaggers was inviting trouble when she mistreated the servants. It was not unheard of for them to take revenge for the person who felt entrapped and powerless to turn to crime. There was the Belgian maid who strangled her elderly employer, and the Irish maid of all work who was hanged at Newgate for bludgeoning her employer, hacking her body into pieces, and Kate shook herself. She couldn't dismiss the fears that menaced her. They were legitimate, for the wrongs Jenny and Harriet had both suffered were real wrongs, just as the Belgian maid and Kate Webster were real murderers, and not merely characters in Belle Bartwell's sensational thrillers. But she couldn't give way to her apprehension, for if she did, she would have to ask herself what would happen to her, caught as she was in the web of her aunt's malice. Kate carried her tray into her room, lighted the fire, and sat down to eat, grateful for the silence and opportunity to be alone. When she was finished, she pulled off her shoes and took out the manuscript of The Conspiracy of the Golden Scarab. If she expected to meet her deadline, she had to work, regardless of what storms might be brewing around her. She scribbled furiously for several hours, pausing only to refill her teacup and mend the fire. When she finally laid down her pen and gulped the last cold tea, her draft of the next chapter, set in an English country manner and featuring characters that greatly resembled Sir Charles Sheridan and Bradford and Eleanor Marston, was done. It was a trifle short on sensation, she thought critically, but it was satisfyingly full of realistic details that her readers loved. Perhaps she could devise a startling plot twist, a death or some other disaster involving the medium, whose character was beginning to seem to Kate more and more ambiguous. She had still the notes she had scribbled after her visit to Mrs. Farnsworth. She might even work Oscar Wilde and Conan Doyle into the plot, suitably disguised, of course. And the Irish maid who had been hanged at Newgate for bludgeoning her mistress.